Welcome back to History Otherwise, where we explore the paths not taken in history. Today, we're opening a file that, honestly, it challenges the very foundations of the modern world. We're stepping into a timeline where the Tudor dynasty, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, a whole lot, it just never happens.
It sounds almost impossible, doesn't it? Because the Tudors feel so inevitable to us. They're just the bedrock of English and, I suppose, British identity. But when you actually dig into the sources from the time, you realize their rise wasn't destiny at all. It was a fluke, a complete statistical anomaly that all hinged on the footing of a single horse in a muddy field.
And that is the perfect place for us to start. For this deep dive, we've kind of structured the research into three distinct layers. First, we have to reconstruct that one single knife-edge moment at Bosworth Field where reality basically forks. Then second, we'll look at the domestic fallout. So, how a victory for Richard III creates a completely different Yorkist England with its center of gravity far from London.
And third, and this is where it gets really mind-bending, we have to zoom out to the global scale. This is where the butterfly effect just kicks in massively. We're looking at evidence that suggests a Yorkist victory means no British Empire, no United States of America, just a completely different map of the world for the last 500 years.
That is a massive claim. So let's get into the forensic details. Take us back to that point of divergence. August 22nd, 1485, Bosworth Field.
Okay, the context here is absolutely critical. You've got Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, and he's defending his crown against this relative unknown Henry Tudor. Now, Tudor history paints Richard as this doomed, hunchbacked villain, but militarily. He was the far superior commander with a far superior force.
I was just looking at the troop estimates in our notes. Richard has somewhere between, 12 and 15,000 men. Henry Tudor's got this ragtag army of maybe 5,000, and a lot of them are French mercenaries who don't even speak English. On paper, this shouldn't even be a battle. It should be a cleanup operation for Richard.
It should have been, absolutely. But Richard has this one huge liability. Loyalty, or the lack of it. The Stanley brothers, Thomas and William, they show up with 6,000 men, a huge force, but they refuse to actually join the fight. They just stand on the sidelines, literally watching, waiting to see who's winning before they commit their troops.
It's the ultimate wait-and-see approach, isn't it? And this forces Richard's hand. He sees the stalemate, he sees this betrayal from the Stanleys brewing, and he decides to end it himself, personally.
He spots Henry Tudor's banner, isolated behind the main lines with just a small bodyguard. And Richard is a warrior king. I mean, he's been fighting since he was a teenager. He knows that if you cut the head off the snake, the rebellion just evaporates. So he leads this charge of his personal household knights. We're talking the best heavy cavalry in England, straight at Henry.
Right. And in our history books, this is where it all goes wrong for him. His horse gets stuck in a marsh, he's surrounded, and he's killed. But for this deep dive, we're saying the ground holds.
That's it. That's the only change we need to make. The ground is a little bit drier. Richard's charge connects. And even the chronicles written later by his enemies, the Tudor historians, they all admit he fought with this terrifying ferocity. He personally kills Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon. He unhorses this giant of a man, Sir John Chain.
Oh, right. Chain was basically the heavyweight champion of his day. Huge man.
And Richard just knocks him off his horse. In this scenario, that momentum carries him all the way through. He reaches Henry Tudor before the Stanleys can even think about intervening. And with one good strike, the Tudor dynasty is strangled in its crib. Henry is dead.
And the effect on the battle must be instantaneous.
Completely. The Tudor cause just ceases to exist in that moment. And here's the fascinating psychological pivot for the Stanleys. They were ready to betray Richard, but now Richard has won. So what do? They have to survive. To prove their loyalty, they immediately turn their 6,000 fresh troops on the fleeing Tudor remnants. It becomes an absolute slaughter.
So the sun sets on August 22nd. Richard III is secure on his throne. But he still has a major PR problem, doesn't he?
He does. He's still plagued by the rumor that he murdered his own nephews,
Yeah.
the princes in the tower. And while the Tudors later blew that story up to make him a monster, at the time it was a very real, very dark cloud over his reign. A victorious Richard has to deal with this if he wants to rule effectively.
The notes suggest a pretty cynical but effective solution. Richard controls the narrative now. He can't bring the boys back, assuming they really are dead, but he can give people closure.
Precisely. We can imagine a piece of very calculated political theater. Sometime in, say, 1486, some workmen at the Tower of London accidentally discover the bones of two young boys. Richard stages a massive, solemn state funeral. He's seen weeping for his lost nephews, and he pins the murder squarely on the Duke of Buckingham, a traitor he'd conveniently already had executed a few years earlier.
That's incredibly convenient. The bad guy's dead. I'm the grieving uncle. Case closed.
It effectively clears the slate. It buys him the political capital he needs for his next move, which is the one that solidifies the dynasty. In our timeline, Henry Tudor marries Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses. In this timeline, Richard III marries her himself.
Wow. To a modern ear, that sounds shocking. Marrying his own niece.
It is shocking to us, but in the 15th century, it was a valid, if extreme, political maneuver. It was actually discussed at the time in diplomatic letters. He needed dispensation from the Pope, of course, but as the victorious King of England, the Pope would almost certainly grant it. By marrying Elizabeth, he neutralizes any remaining Yorkist opposition. He then names his capable adult nephew, the Earl of Lincoln, as his heir, and suddenly the succession is secure. The House of York is a fortress, not a ruin.
Okay, so this new security, this stability, it leads to one of the most interesting geographic shifts in this whole scenario. We're so used to London being the center of everything. The Tudors are very London-centric, but Richard, he wasn't.
Not at all. He was a man of the north. This is a key insight. Richard's power base was Yorkshire. His home was Middleham Castle. He'd already set up the Council of the North. If he survives Bosworth, that council evolves. It becomes a semi-autonomous government. York effectively becomes a second capital for England.
Which fundamentally changes the economic DNA of the country. In our history, the North becomes marginalized, the grim North, the industrial backyard. But here you have wealth, patronage, the royal court frequently sitting in York.
It rebalances the whole island. Instead of London sucking all the oxygen out of the room, you have a dual-pole economy. The North-South divide, which is still such a huge part of British life today, it looks completely different. It's a more balanced kingdom, perhaps a less centralized one.
But that lack of centralization brings us to the biggest divergence of all, religion. The Tudor legacy is defined by the break with Rome. Henry VIII and his 6 wives, the creation of the Church of England. If Henry Tudor dies in that field, Henry VIII is never born.
And if Henry VIII is never born? Well, the English Reformation was not some theological inevitability. This is the crucial point. The break with Rome was a political accident. It was caused specifically by Henry VIII's obsession with getting a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Richard III and his successors have no such need. They are perfectly content Catholic kings.
So England just stays Catholic.
Yes, and the consequences of that are as much financial as they are spiritual. Think about the dissolution of the monasteries. In the 1530s, Henry VIII seized about a quarter of all the land in England from the church. That massive injection of cash is what allowed the Tudor state to build the Royal Navy, the coastal forts, a modern bureaucracy.
It was the biggest land transfer since the Norman conquest. Without that seizure of assets, the Yorkist crown is, well, it's a lot poorer.
Much poorer. And a poor king is a weak king. He's much more dependent on Parliament for taxes.
Yeah.
So, ironically, the survival of this medieval Yorkist dynasty might have led to a limited constitutional monarchy much earlier, simply because the king couldn't afford to be an absolute tyrant. He can't afford a huge standing army or a massive spy network like Elizabeth I had.
And that lack of cash, combined with being Catholic, completely reshapes foreign policy. The Tudors were obsessed with Spain. Spain was the enemy. But the Yorkists.
The Yorkists were traditionally allied with Burgundy, and by extension the Habsburgs in Spain. Their whole economy was based on the wool trade across the North Sea. So Yorkist England is a friend to Spain. There is no Spanish Armada in 1588. There's no great ideological war against the Catholic superpowers.
Right, and this is the thread that unravels the entire history of the New World. If England is friends with Spain and England is Catholic, what on earth happens to America?
This is probably the biggest takeaway for a listener, and it's a huge one. The United States as we know it simply does not exist.
Okay, let's break that down, because that seems like a massive leap from Richard wins one battle to America doesn't exist.
It's all cause and effect. Think about how English exploration actually happened. Who were the heroes? Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, the Sea Dogs.
Yeah.
In reality, they were state-sponsored pirates. They were attacking Spanish gold fleets. Queen Elizabeth looked the other way because she desperately needed the money.
They were looting gold to fund the state.
But a Yorkist king who's allied with Spain, he treats Francis Drake like a criminal, not a hero. He hangs him for piracy. You don't rob your allies. So the main financial motive for early English naval expansion is just gone. But even more important is the demographic engine. Who actually settled New England? Who landed at Plymouth Rock?
The Pilgrims, Puritans, fleeing religious persecution.
Exactly. They were fleeing the Church of England, a state church they felt was too corrupt, too popish. But in our Yorkist timeline, England is still Catholic. There is no Anglican compromise for them to hate. There are no Puritans. The entire movement never comes into being.
No Puritans means no Pilgrims, no Massachusetts Bay Colony.
No Thanksgiving. The specific group of religious dissenters who created the cultural and political DNA of the United States, they never leave England. They don't exist as a group.
So who colonizes North America? Someone's going to claim it.
The vacuum is filled by the French and the Spanish. You probably see New France extending all the way down the East Coast. Maybe Quebec stretches to what we call Manhattan. Or perhaps a century later, a Yorkist England establishes a small, state-run colony. But it would be strictly Catholic, feudal, and loyal to the crown.
It wouldn't be a laboratory for democracy.
Not in a million years. It might be called New Yorkshire, but it would just be another province of the crown. The entire concept of American liberty, the republic, the Constitution, it all evaporates. All because a king 500 years ago didn't need a divorce.
That is just mind-bending. The entire geopolitical map of the 20th century is wiped clean. And the ripples hit closer to home, too. What about Scotland?
Good point. In our timeline, the union of the crowns, where the King of Scotland also becomes the King of England, that happens because Henry VII married his daughter, Margaret Tudor, to the King of Scotland.
A strategic marriage to secure the northern border.
Correct. But with no Henry VII, there's no Margaret Tudor. That marriage alliance never happens. The Stuart dynasty never inherits the English throne. England and Scotland remain two separate and probably hostile kingdoms.
And if England remains Catholic, while Scotland, under figures like John Knox, becomes fiercely Presbyterian.
You've got a recipe for brutal sectarian warfare. A Catholic England might well invade Scotland to try and put Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne and crush the Protestant rebels. The island of Britain could be torn apart by religious wars for a century. Rather than being united, there is no united kingdom.
It sounds like a much more fractured and maybe more violent island.
But perhaps less violent internally in other ways. We have to ask about the English Civil War. In our timeline, the 1640s saw the king beheaded and a republic formed under Oliver Cromwell. A uniquely traumatic event.
Does that still happen in this Yorkist world?
Conflict is inevitable, of course. Nobles always want more power. But the kind of conflict changes. The Civil War, we know, was ideological. Puritan Parliament versus a high church king. Without the Puritan movement, you don't get an Oliver Cromwell. You don't get a republic.
So what do you get instead?
You get a throwback, a proper Game of Thrones-style dynastic struggle. Powerful families like the Percys and the Nevilles fighting for control of the crown or the regency. It would be a civil war of barons, not of ideas. It keeps England looking medieval for much longer.
Right. And it creates a society that's maybe more rigid.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
Without the Tudors brutally centralizing power and killing off the old nobility, England stays more feudal. You'd have a limited monarchy checked by powerful barons, not by a democratic House of Commons.
Which brings us to what I think is the Tudor paradox, a crucial realization from all this. We tend to think of the Tudors, especially Henry VIII and Bloody Mary, as paranoid, chaotic tyrants. But your analysis suggests that very chaos was the engine of progress.
That's the uncomfortable truth, isn't it? The Tudors were insecure usurpers. They had a weak claim to the throne, and that insecurity forced them to innovate. They had to build a navy to survive the Spanish threat. They had to break the power of the old nobility to feel safe. They had to create a modern state to manage the chaos of the Reformation.
Their desperation drove the modernization of England.
Exactly. Whereas Richard III represented legitimacy, stability. A Yorkist England is more stable, more agrarian, more traditional. It's a quieter country.
A quieter history.
Maybe the average person is happier. No monasteries burning, less religious persecution, no horrific civil war that kills a huge percentage of the population. But globally, England remains a second-rate power. It becomes a very nice, large version of, say, Denmark. Comfortable, but not an imperial superpower.
We lose the British Empire. We lose the Industrial Revolution, which was so tied up with that Protestant capital. We probably lose Shakespeare as we know him.
We trade global dominance for domestic peace. Really makes you ask, is greatness worth the bloodshed? The world the Tudors built is the world we now inhabit, dynamic, industrial, English-speaking. But it was built on a foundation of violence that a Yorkist victory might have avoided.
It really does all come back to that one moment in the mud at Bosworth. The footing of a single horse determined whether England became a global empire or a quiet Catholic kingdom on the edge of Europe.
It's the ultimate lesson in chaos theory, I think. History isn't a straight line. It's a series of branching paths, and we're just walking down one of them, assuming it was the only way. but it really wasn't.
A fascinating and slightly unsettling perspective on the fragility of our world. We'll leave you with that thought to ponder. Would you trade the modern world for the stability of New Yorkshire? Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the history otherwise.
Puts a whole new light on your next history book, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Until next time.